Good day, everyone, and welcome to the first edition of what we are calling Goal of the Month, where we will be highlighting one SDG every month. And this month, we are highlighting SDG 1, which is poverty. Our first guest for today is none other than the Dean of the EMS Faculty, Prof. Mabugu, who is also an expert in poverty and inequality, as well as public policy. Prof, it's great to have you here. And I think we're going to get straight into the conversation with our first question, which is, as a development economist, how would you define poverty?
Thank you very much, Elma. Thanks for the invitation. That is actually, I start with a sigh because it's not an easy definition. Okay, there have been obviously standards that have been used over time so that we are able to work with something. In general, you could think of poverty as a deprivation. So it's a state in which an individual or most of the time a household do not have or lack financial as well as material resources that are fundamental for minimum standards of living. This, of course, includes availability and access to food, availability, access to housing, education, health, and many others. So it is really a condition in which that household or that individual standards of living are below a specified threshold.
Mm. And I mean, we live in a country and a continent that is really dealing with poverty at a very high intensity. And some people always say, well, let's blame the government. Others will say, let's blame individuals. Some will say, let's blame international organizations, private institutions. But whose responsibility is it to alleviate poverty?
Again, another very good question. I would say that to those people who blame this one or the other, that's probably not the right way to approach poverty. So I like your question, whose responsibility is it? And the answer to that, from my point of view, is that it is everyone's responsibility, okay? So obviously what you need in order for you to alleviate poverty and eventually to eradicate it, because that's the ideal, that's where we want to go. That's the idea from the UN's SDGs by 2030. We want to be in a position where nobody is poor, where no one lacks resources, financially or material, in order for them to have a standard of living that's acceptable. So in order to do this, you need resources, or an institution or whoever would try to alleviate poverty needs to have resources. They need as well, in addition, power to be able to use these resources for good. And for good, I mean for poverty eradication. So who are some of these types of resources, big institutions, I'm sorry. So the government, for example, is one big institution that is available and is there and has the power to certainly eradicate poverty. In fact, in a theory, one of the reasons why a government exists is in fact to redistribute income and resources. This is in the case where a market fails. So the market is there to grow economies, for example. But it can be that the growth of the economy does not trickle down to the poor. And the government is specifically there to be able to ensure that they gather resources from different agents within an economy and then redistribute this towards those that are in need, towards those that are lacking such resources. So a government is a very big player in reducing poverty. They have the power to levy taxes and redistribute taxes. They have the power to borrow money if needed and then to levy taxes, to alleviate poverty. They have the power to work with the economy, with markets, so that markets grow. So they facilitate the growth of economies and use that growth once again to eradicate poverty. The market itself, here I'm talking about the private sector, also have a responsibility. So apart from the institution, government, the institution, private sector also has a role to play in alleviating. This they do as they go about their business of growing economies. They produce goods and services. If an economy is thriving, this would be affordable. And of course, this is very important for poor individuals and households. They produce jobs. Because in order for you to grow an economy, you use labor as part of the instruments or means of production for that economy. So the private sector, and I just mentioned a few here, has also the responsibility to alleviate poverty. Mm-hmm. And then let me come broadly to society. I say society also has a role to play, and the responsibility to play with in order to eradicate poverty. This is society not only in a specific country, but also international societies. And why is this? Because, well, if we do not have, firstly, if we have poverty, we are likely to see unrest, we are likely to see unjust circumstances for people. And these are things that society cannot or should not tolerate. And so being part of that institution that eradicates poverty is absolutely critical for society. Society can do this in many different ways, ensuring that the governments are working, are delivering services, are alleviating poverty, are looking after poor people, ensuring that the market itself as an institution is just in what it does, but even as individuals also assisting where we can over and above the taxes that we pay in alleviating poverty. So that's why I say all of us have a role to play in this. Mm-hmm. Others are more powerful than some, the government, for example, but indeed everyone has a role to play.
I would agree with you there, Prof, and say that it's not the sole responsibility of a single entity, but rather a cohesive and a combined effort. A saying comes to mind, which is, if it's up to be, it's up to me. So I think we also need to start taking on that individual responsibility. What can I do to make a difference and leave an impact? Now, the third question is, you mentioned the UN SDGs, and those were drafted to be realized in 2030, like you rightfully said. We're 8 years away. Yes. And for some, it doesn't seem like we are any closer than when we started. What are we doing wrong? What are we doing right? And so if we are doing something right, we can continue on that path.
I start with saying, unfortunately, COVID hit us. Okay, so well, we know that there were some African countries that were really doing a lot, putting in as much effort as is expected to move towards eradicating poverty, whether it be in increasing education opportunities, in ensuring that health systems are strong, in providing social assistance, among others. But of course, COVID hit, and we are back at least 3-4 years behind. What are we doing wrong? We probably are not doing enough. I think every nation, I could not imagine that there is any specific country or nation that wants to have poor people in its country. So we try different things, but a lot goes wrong, and without strong governance, without strong institutions, we find ourselves lacking. So even if you have a very good, vibrant, potentially increasing growth in an economy, if there are institutions that are stealing part of that money, they put it very simply, then we're not going nowhere, because this money that was earmarked for poor people is not really landing where it's supposed to go. Mm-hmm. So we need to have very strong institutions. We need to have strong governance. We need to ensure that money that is earmarked, or resources, let me put it more broadly, earmarked for poor people do indeed end up with poor people. We need to ensure that the private sector is playing its part and that we have justice within our economies. Without these specifics, we will not get it right. Policies that are good abound. I mean, we have them in almost every country, but implementation is not always as good as the policy, and we need to get that right. We need as well to ensure that poverty is something we do not tolerate. So 2 years ago, just before COVID, actually slightly longer than 2 years, Ramos Mabugu, Ismail Fofana, and myself, my co-authors, wrote a paper in which we were looking at all African countries and understanding which ones would make it in terms of having poverty. We're not even talking eradicating by 2030. And sadly, even before COVID, we saw that less than 40% of the countries could be able to have poverty if they continued on the trajectory that they were at within the African continent. As I said, sadly, we know that this is now not going to happen unless if something miraculous happens in the next few years. We need to have economic growth. That is part of the message that we have in our paper. We need as well for some countries, and South Africa is one of them, to reduce inequalities, because inequalities as high as we have in our continent, in our country, South Africa, this actually works against our aim to reduce poverty. But then we need a lot of other things as well, strengthening our health systems, our education systems, entrepreneurship, among many others. So implement policies, be brave if you are an institution such as the government, be brave enough to go for poverty eradication, including availing social grants and others.
Yeah. And I think our final question for this short yet very informative interview is, being surrounded by poverty can seem like doom and gloom for a lot of people. In fact, they say that the environment you are surrounded by is what you become. And so what enables people who are born into impoverished environments to get out of it?
That's a good question. If I had the answer, probably I would be one of the most powerful people here. I have the answer, but it's difficult to implement. So it's related to what I was saying before. I think that what's important is for us to identify the most vulnerable groups. So I'm thinking here, women, children. So tackle those and immediately bring them at least to the level of men, even at that poverty level. Yeah. Very, very important. Look at the most basic. So in South Africa and many other countries, we have a food poverty line, we have a lower bound poverty line, we have an upper bound poverty line. Start at the food poverty line, move to the lower bound, where you are now saying food plus others, and then to the upper bound. So be progressive in terms of trying to implement policies and activities that aim at reducing poverty. If this is done systematically, then I think we have a chance. In South Africa, we've been reluctant to really go forcefully to social development, social grants, for example, or basic income support of some sort for those who are unemployed, people between the ages of 18 and 59. Why is that? Okay, some say because we don't have enough money in the country. Perhaps we will never actually have enough money to eradicate poverty. We must just be brave enough to say, with what we have, let's progressively bring poor people into a state of acceptance.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for your time, Prof. Mabugu. I think this first conversation about the SDG Goal 1, which is to end poverty in all its forms everywhere, is a conversation that should be happening all over the world, specifically in the African continent, specifically in the country South Africa. And I hope that from conversations like these, speaking about solutions, because it's one thing to talk about the problem, but speaking about the solution will be conversations that I had more often, and that from it we will be able to actually move forward and realize the goal that has been placed before us. So thank you very much for your time, for your insightful information, and it was lovely having you here.
Thank you very much, Elma. All the best.